This is a video that I've decided to make that I kind of wish I had when I was considering and when I was starting to dot paint. So I would actually recommend, I mean, there's different ways that you can approach it, but I would recommend taking the harder approach because it'll make life easier in the long run. So I would actually recommend starting with some heavy body paint. These are just some cheap ones that I got initially from Amazon. I don't know if they're still available, but there's also many other brands of heavy body paint that you can use, but I just thought I would use these cheaper Amazon ones initially. And so as you can see, the paint consistency is very thick. And initially you can use water, but I would actually recommend, if you want to take dotting seriously, getting either the Liquitex Gloss Medium or the Liquitex, it's another one that I haven't tried that a lot of people use, which is, I think it's just the medium or pouring medium. That's what it is. And so you use quite a bit to thin it down, and I'm just going to use just a pencil initially to show that you can get really good dots with any tool. It's just that the other tools have other benefits, like they're more comfortable, more even dot sizes. And so if you play around with dot consistency, with the paint consistency, if you can use heavy body paint, then if you go for something like your standard, what a lot of people use, which is Deco Art Americana or Joe Sonia, that's another straight out the tube, really good. But the thing is, the second you've got the paint out, it will start to thicken. So by the time you've bought a brand new tube, by the time you get to the end, especially, you know, one of the things that I would do when I first started, because I didn't want to waste paint, was I would actually dot from the container lid. But then eventually I realized that it's a lot easier to use a paint tray and figure out how to learn paint consistency. And then once I got paint consistency right, so if you look at the way that it flows, so if you dip whatever you're using into it and then it goes back down, so that's, at the moment it's on the thicker side. It really depends on what type of dots you want. So for this example, I'm going to thin it just a smidgen more, which will bring it pretty close to the paint consistency of the Deco Art range. So if you've never done it and you've always wanted to, you know, you see other people's dot work and you want to give it a try, you can literally, if you just grab just a tube of black heavy body paint, and even if you just initially use water to thin it down, and then if you feel like you enjoy it, then get some gloss medium or pouring medium. So you can see now it kind of goes down and flattens out quite quickly. And another tip, if you end up getting a lot of air bubbles in it, if you just tap it on the table, it'll help to get rid of a lot of the bubbles. And so then you really want to play around with how much paint is on the tool and then you can really start to play around with, I would start with individual dots. And the closer you can have the paint to whatever it is that you're dotting will make life easier. And paper is actually not the best surface, just because it starts to absorb the paint really quickly. And it also catches the paint, and it is harder to get it to sort of spread out. And then you can just tip, if you just touch just the edge of the paint on the surface, you can get the dots to go smaller with the same size tool. Which now I'll switch over. These are nail stylus dotting tools that are pretty common. People often use them because they're quite cheap. You can get a pack of 5 or 6 really cheaply. So this is what you'll hear people refer to as walking the dots. It's just getting the paint, and it depends how much paint you put on there. So if I was to put even more paint, it's going to give a lot bigger dots. And something that I've learned is getting to look at the tool, how much the paint moves or how much it stays. So if I didn't thin this down that second time, it wouldn't move on the tool as much. And if you've got too much on there, you can just dab some of it off, and then it'll get lighter, smaller dots. Whereas if you dip it again, it'll get bigger. And so I might go the other end now to the bigger end. So that's a lot bigger. And then there's things like this, the Happy Dottings company. The biggest thing I like about them is easy to see numbers and 0.5 mm size differences between them. And so same thing, if I keep adding more and more, that dot's going to get bigger. And you'll notice there I was dipping and dotting, and so that's how you get more consistent dot size. Because if I use this same tool, if I put more paint on it this time, so as you can see, it was the same tool, but because I've put more paint on the tool, the dots are larger. And then if I walk the dots on this, there's less and less. And you'll also notice if you're doing larger projects, all of the time that the tool has got paint on it and it's exposed to air, that paint is slowly drying on the tool. So if you are dotting for say 10 minutes with the same tool, you'll notice gradually over time the dot size will actually get larger and larger. So it's a good idea to wipe the tool quite regularly. And then this is also the same, in the same set. There's two ball ends. And if you don't fully touch it to the surface with the first couple, you'll end up with more paint on the tool longer. And then this is, I've sharpened this end to just a point for popping bubbles, but it's also handy for really tiny dots. And then this one's just got just a tiny little ball on the end. So it's very much the same as the nail stylus tools, which if I dip and dot, and it will also, if I dip it multiple times, will be different than, and as well as if you stir it around, it'll grab more paint and slightly larger dots. So I've just put a heap on there, but I've got it to run down the tool. So initially if I dot it, it's only going to be little, but if I wait for that paint to start coming down, it'll get bigger and bigger. And I wouldn't recommend trying to paint a mandala initially. The more time you spend practicing with different tools, different paint consistency, the less frustration you'll run into, and then you can just really focus on the creative side. So I'll do this with the fine point. As you can see, the dots are absolutely tiny. Which I'll go back. To the pencil. And so this time I'm only just dipping it less. And if you dip it the same amount in the paint each time, it'll really help to get even sized dots. So as you can see, that's just with a pencil and it's quite uniform, the dot size. So now, I'll switch to another colour. So depending on what you want, that could be classed as thin or thick. But I would say it's probably just a tiny bit thicker than Deco Art Americana. But just a tiny bit. And as you can see, I've got less paint in there this time. So if I clean this tool, and so this time it's barely covering the ball. And the more you practice, the more you will start to be able to see how much spacing you need between them. And that's why, you know, things like this where they bleed together, surfaces like paper, the cast stones, like the candle holders and stuff like that, can have a tendency to do that as well. It really just, yeah, it takes practice dotting on each different surface. And it's just the more you practice dotting in straight lines, dotting around corners, it'll make life a lot easier. So if I was starting out again, I would really focus on straight line dotting. So I would just literally grab a ruler, and that's why I've done the outline here. Just draw some lines and dot, just see how much you can follow the line. And then, you know, even if you do something like this, just print out or draw on a piece of paper and just see if you can follow what it is that you're dotting. And then the more you do it, the more you'll build up muscle memory as well. And also the hand-eye coordination, where when I finish this, I'm going to do just a couple of tiny mandalas just to show once you get to a certain point, you can actually just eyeball, and you don't really need as much guidelines and stencils, which they're really handy initially. And it's funny because that line that I drew by hand was actually not as straight as I can dot. And then so this is just a straight tube of Joe Sonia. Which is slightly thicker than the Deco Art. And so I purposely did them close to each other. You'll see probably in a couple of moments they'll probably start to bleed together. If you were to, say you were to do like if you were doing a mandala and you did the first row, and if you wanted to do the second row really tight, if you let them, I mean, if you look up here, some of the smaller dots have already started to like have that dry sealing effect. So if I wanted to go back and dot right next to these, there'd be a lot less chance of it bleeding through. But when you've got wet next to wet, they will often bleed through, which is why you'll often see people leaving a bit of space and then they'll go back and then they'll put dots in between different things, which I'm looking and I haven't really got anything like that I can show. And then for this, I might and keeping paper towel or a damp cloth close by will really help for cleaning tools, and a lot of people use cotton buds if they want to wipe off a dot. Wiping off a dot off paper is it's too absorbent. And if you can practice smaller and larger dots as well, so that's why I've decided to do this here. And then I'll do some bigger dots in a moment. And when you're just starting out, don't worry about any messes or things not looking like they're perfect. Just try and take each thing you're doing just to really get more of a feel for the paint and the tool. And obviously this lettering isn't that great for this example, but it actually looks better on camera than it does on the paper. And so now okay, and start dotting the. So if you try and aim to get the tool exactly in the middle, so say this was a cross where you were going to start a mandala, if you try and line up, like especially how I've got quite a bit of paint on there, if you can get just that first initial bit of paint where you want it, it's a lot easier then to get it to be centered. And then the same thing. And always remember as well, so if I only just push down a little bit, it's going to be small. But if I push the tool all the way, you can see how it squashes out. And then also if the dot isn't really that consistent, you can always go back and touch it again, and it'll add more paint and it'll create more of an even dot. And then as well, if you can start to learn how much the paint's going to spread, you can start to estimate how much spacing. So if you look at where the tool is, if you look at the gap there, I'm leaving a bigger gap because I know it's going to expand when I add more paint to it. And especially if you go a second time, the dot's going to keep growing. But this is really good practice, just dotting on a straight line. And the more you take your time initially, it'll feel like you're going really slow. But when you're going that slow, you'll start to really develop the hand-eye coordination, where it just becomes instinctive. And even like that, I could feel that I hadn't put quite enough paint on the tool. And then so the reason I've left that is so that I could line up that corner and then come back and put that dot roughly between the two. And before I go down, I'm just quickly going to so if you want to practice doing the start, the more you practice the start of a mandala, the better your mandalas are going to look, because the way you start it really determines how the rest of the project's going to go. So I'm going to go back down to a smaller one. And I'm leaving a larger gap because it's on paper to try and stop it bleeding and connecting. But if you can start without any guidelines, just doing top and bottom and side to side, and then go roughly halfway between, and then also remember, so don't go and line up just in between because you're going to be too close in. But if you look at roughly how far apart and then come out, and then this, I should be able to get another one in without it bleeding. And another thing to remember as well is it's a lot easier if you turn your work so that you're always, you know, if you're always dotting on the top side, keep turning the artwork and so that you're always on that top side or the bottom side. I find the top side's a lot easier because then you can see what you're working with. And so then it really depends. You know, and another good thing to do is gradual increases in size. I've just made a mess with paint. So if you do go for some dotting tools, so I was using a 1mm before, going up to a 1.5 on the next row. Which it's easier if you actually skip one. And then come back. And so if I turn this, and then if we go for a bigger one, and also while you're dotting, practice resting your spare fingers, and then I like to put my fingers on the tool so that I've got a thumb and 3 fingers, so I can basically anchor and get it exactly where I want it. So it's easy to move it in and out and up and down, while simultaneously really looking at where I want to put it. Because if you're trying to just, like, I'm not going to support it. If I try and do it, you've got to have a really steady hand, but then you can often move it at that last second. But just, it takes a while to sort of like build up a memory of where you've painted to not stick your fingers in wet paint. Which, if this was on a piece of wood that I'd prepared or a canvas, it would look a lot better. But like I was mentioning before, so I mean, if I look, I don't know how well this is going to show up. In person, you can see how, because of the grain of the paper on these dots, they're quite jaggedy. I'm just not sure how well that's showing up on the camera, because on the camera they look quite hard to see, the jaggedy bits. But anyone that paints in person, you'll be able to see the difference. And so I might just do just a bottom row, same as the top row, which I might turn this around, make my life a bit easier. I might zoom in. Right, that's that's in frame. So really lining up that cross. And now the paint, there's less and less paint in this tray. So if I wanted the dot sizes to be really consistent, I would have filled up this paint. And then just for the end, it's also good to practice some bigger ones as well. And then you can also practice walking the dots. So if you start out with a larger dot on the tips, which you could do this by using a larger tool. And then without adding more paint, and the more you can try and line up where you've done that dot on that side, so try and mirror your spacing so that they end up quite level at the end. Which all I'm doing is I'm just doing 5. And like I mentioned earlier, if you spin the artwork, it's a lot easier. But then it's also good practice to not spin it. But initially I would definitely recommend spinning it, just to create less frustration. And so that was a 1mm. And if I grab a 2, all right, I hope that helps. Have an awesome day.